Since I started working on this book, in the summer of 1982, nearly every dimension of futures trading has exploded in growth. There are brand new exchanges, new contracts, more advisory and news services, an increasing variety of books and publications, and ever more sophisticated technical trading systems, most all of them with computer applications to make it easy to track the markets. However, even with this tremendous growth in services related to trading, one inescapable fact remains. There is still a very small group of sophisticated traders who take the greatest percentage of profits out of the markets, making well over 90% of all the other traders net losers year in and year out. In futures trading, for every dollar of profit gained by one trader, there has to be an equivalent dollar lost by another trader. If a few traders are consistently making money on a grand scale, then their profits have to be coming directly out of the pockets of the thousands of other traders who very faithfully contribute to their daily winnings. Some of these very successful traders are public figures, but most are only known in the Chicago or New York areas. Needless to say, everyone wants to know what they do and how they do it. There must be a difference between these two groups of traders, the small minority of winners and the vast majority of losers who want to know what the winners know. The difference is that the traders who can make money consistently on a weekly, monthly, and yearly basis approach trading from the perspective of a mental discipline. When asked for their secrets of success, they categorically state that they didn't achieve any measure of consistency in accumulating wealth from trading until they learned self-discipline, emotional control, and the ability to change their minds to flow with the markets. First, I want to point out that self-discipline, emotional control, and learning to change one's mind after making a commitment are all psychological issues that have nothing to do with news services, advisory services, new exchanges, or technical or fundamental trading systems, computerized or not. Second, from my trading experiences, observations, and research, I have discovered that all traders, both winners and losers, seem to share some very common experiences. Either in the beginning or at some point early in their trading career, all traders experience confusion, frustration, anxiety, and the pain of failure. The few traders who pass through this phase to accumulate wealth are those who eventually confront and work through some very difficult psychological issues about what it means to be a trader. And this process of realization and change normally takes several years, even for the best of them. If self-discipline and emotional control are the keys to success, they are also not necessarily traits any of us are born with. On the contrary, they are characteristics we acquire by learning certain mental skills. Acquiring these mental skills is often the result of a trial-and-error learning process that can be very costly financially and usually filled with emotional pain and suffering. The biggest problem with a trial-and-error approach in trading is that most people lose all their money before they get through the process, and other traders who have enough money to keep on trading never fully recover from the effects of the psychological trauma they have inflicted on themselves to ever learn how to trade successfully on a consistent basis. This leaves only a relatively small number of people who make it. All the great traders, both past and present, have found it very difficult to explain what it is they do, how they do it, and more important, the progression of steps they took to get where they got. Many would gladly share with others what they know about the market and its behavior, but not necessarily about their behavior as individuals. They would, however, often caution those who sought their wisdom to understand that all the market knowledge in the world won't do them any good until they learned what can be called self-discipline and emotional control, without necessarily being able to explain what they were. For instance, cut your losses short is great advice that is often given as an axiom of trading wisdom. But how do you explain to someone the steps needed to learn how to do that? Especially when he is interacting with an environment that is in perpetual motion and will always offer him the possibility that the market can come back and make him whole if he is in a losing trade. If you take into consideration that his money and self-esteem are at stake and the market coming back is always a viable possibility, regardless of how remote it may be, then you can see how difficult it is to explain why he needs to cut his losses. It is even more difficult to explain how he can do it in a way that suits his unique psychological makeup. The easiest way to explain how to apply this type of wisdom, without actually explaining it at all, is to say, well, if you want to be a successful trader, you need to learn self-discipline and emotional control. I don't believe this type of vague advice was intentional, however, for principally two reasons. First, self-discipline and emotional control are abstract concepts that are not easily explained or understood. We all hear or read the words a lot, but ask anyone you know to define either of these concepts, and you'll probably get a blank stare. Second, today's successful traders started out their journey without maps, signposts, or guidelines, or the benefit of knowing exactly where they had to end up, from a psychological perspective, to accumulate their fortune. They had to explore the trading world through a means of self-reflection and readjustment that was very demanding and time-consuming. One could say they more or less stumbled through it, learning from each mistake, small and others that were devastating both financially and emotionally. At some point, they probably realized that something about themselves had changed because the normal kind of market activity that once had a very negative emotional impact on them, like anger, stress, anxiety, and fear, just didn't have that same effect any longer. They must have gained some measure of confidence in themselves to respond appropriately to all possible market conditions, because there is a direct correlation between a person's level of confidence and the negative emotions mentioned. Confidence and fear are states of mind that are similar in nature, only separated by degree. As a person's level of confidence increases, his or her degree of confusion, anxiety, and fear dissipates proportionately. This confidence would naturally develop as people learned to trust themselves to do whatever needed to be done, without hesitation. As a result of this kind of self-trust, they would no longer need to fear the seemingly unpredictable and erratic behavior of the markets. However, the main point I am making here is that the process of change that took place was in the mental environment and psychological makeup of each individual trader. The markets didn't change. The tools that were used didn't change. The trader did. Now, when traders go through a transition in their personal development and learn a new skill on a trial-and-error basis, it is unlikely that they would keep a detailed record of the steps to that learning process, especially if that process was characterized by pain, anxiety, and frustration. Obviously, if someone doesn't know exactly how they acquired the skills they now have, then, naturally, it would be extremely difficult for them to explain to someone else how they got them. Besides, when it comes to trading, once someone is making the kind of money he had always dreamed of, there isn't much incentive to spend the time and energy necessary to break down these abstract skills into an effective learning process from which others can derive some benefit. Developing educational programs to explain how to become a successful trader requires a completely different set of skills from the skills necessary to be a trader. As will be explained in a moment, the learning process and the kind of personal transformation that was necessary to enable me to write this book was distinctly different from the kind of learning process I experienced as a trader to realize why a book like this needed to be written. One learning process was chosen, and the other was forced. What I mean by forced is, I had to lose my house, my car, and practically everything else I owned to learn some of the ways in which I needed to change my perspective to operate in the trading environment effectively. Losing all my possessions was a complete life-altering experience, an experience that taught me a lot about the nature of fear and the debilitating effects it has on a person's ability to trade effectively. The kind of insight I gained as a result of this experience is the type of learning process I call a forced awareness. This is where the nature and characteristics of the environment I was operating in were much different from what I believed they were. First, out of ignorance, and because I put up mental defenses to block my perception of certain information. Eventually, I was forced by the markets to acknowledge many things about myself that I otherwise wouldn't consider. When all the external symbols that represented a major part of my identity were gone, I didn't have any other choice and was forced to perceive myself in new and different ways. These events occurred in March 1982. At the time, I was an account executive with Merrill Lynch Commodities at its Chicago Board of Trade office. Less than a year before, in June 1981, I moved from the suburbs of Detroit, where I was enjoying, at least financially, a very successful career in commercial property and casualty insurance. I left Michigan and success to move to Chicago and be a trader. I went to work for Merrill Lynch because I didn't have enough money to buy a seat at the Board of Trade or the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, and didn't know that you could lease seats at that time. I had an expensive apartment on the Gold Coast of Chicago and a Porsche. I was maintaining a house in an affluent suburb of Detroit that my girlfriend and her 2 daughters were living in, and I was driving or flying back and forth between the 2 cities almost every weekend to visit them. I was under extreme financial pressure to succeed because my lifestyle expenditures were far and away in excess of what I could afford. Unless I made it big as a trader, it would be very hard to reconcile some of the decisions I made to put myself in that kind of a situation. By the time I moved to Chicago, I had already been trading for over 2 years. Twice, before moving, I lost all my trading capital. Of course, I would quickly save up and start again. My brief periods of success and few winning trades were enough to justify that I continue trying. Once I was very close to making over $250,000 on a trade, but I pulled out of it just before the big move. This devastated me, but I also became completely hooked on trading and even more determined to be successful. From that experience, I decided to buy all the books I could get and attend all the seminars I could afford. Something stated in virtually all the books I read was that it is very difficult to learn how to trade or sustain any success if one is under a great deal of financial pressure. Meaning, don't expect to become a successful trader if you have limited trading capital, or if you are trading with money you can't afford to lose. I was obviously violating both these rules because I had very little trading capital relative to my lifestyle that I absolutely could not afford to lose. Also, I had a lot of other evidence that the odds were not exactly in my favor. I came to Chicago because I believed that if I could get close to the action and meet people who knew how to trade, I could then learn from them. I was in for a very rude awakening. I was at Merrill Lynch Commodities, its second largest commodity office, with 38 account executives. At first, I was shocked to find out only one of the account executives had any experience trading his own money. Then I was further shocked to learn that none of these account executives had any customers who were making any money. In fact, the typical customer lost his original stake within an average of 4 months. My next major disappointment came when I began to meet and make friends with as many floor traders as possible, believing that if the guys up in the offices don't know how to make money, the floor traders certainly must. Again, I found the same conditions that existed up in the offices. Other than a handful of floor traders who had a reputation and a mystique that everyone seemed to be in awe of, I couldn't find one person who was making money consistently, who wasn't confused or knew what he wanted to do and then did it, without first having to ask everyone around him for confirmation that he was doing the right thing. I am not implying that I didn't meet traders who at some point in the day hadn't made money. They just couldn't keep it. I knew many traders who could make $2,000 or $3,000 the first couple of hours of trading, but they would always lose it back, plus more, a short time afterward. Everybody seemed to be suffering from the same kinds of problems and mistakes that nobody really recognized as problems. Obviously, the nature of the markets made it easy not to have to confront anything that otherwise might be perceived as a problem, because the next trade always had the possibility of making everything else in one's life seem irrelevant. Why deal with anything if the next trade can make you rich? All the traders I knew, including myself, were affected by this type of big trade mentality. In fact, my big trade mentality was so pervasive that I would refuse to take profits of $500 or $750 in many trades, even when I knew that's all there was to be made. This may sound absurd, but I wouldn't take profits of such small amounts because, at that time, it felt as if the market was insulting me by offering such paltry sums compared to what I needed or expected. As my financial problems grew, so did my desperation, and I certainly wasn't comforted by anything I saw going on around me. But I still held on to the belief that I could trade out of these difficulties. That is until March 1982. by then, it was all over. A mere 8 months after moving to Chicago to pursue my dreams of financial independence, I had nothing left except my job, apartment, clothes, a television, and a bed. Practically overnight, almost all the symbols that validated my identity were gone. What I mean is, a big part of my self-concept was made up of my possessions like my house, my car, and especially my credit. Maintaining flawless credit was something I had always been proud of. Now I found myself without any of these things. As I've already pointed out, it's not as if there hadn't been plenty of evidence to suggest the possibility of this happening, because there had been. But there was a part of me that wouldn't allow a direct confrontation with this evidence or the implications. It was just too easy to make excuses for all the things going on around me that didn't add up. Refusing to confront or consider the implications of all the conflicting information created a great deal of stress. And to compound the situation, I had this intense fear that I would lose everything. But again, I did everything possible to hide this fear and put it somewhere in my mind where I couldn't feel it. Yet, there must have been a part of me that sensed my impending fall. Why else would I have been so consumed with fear? But how could I face any of this when I had no way of reconciling the imbalance that losing all of these things would create? What I mean is, the imbalance between what I believed about myself and the things that validated these beliefs. Who would I be after all these things were gone? Well, it didn't take me very long to find out. As my financial condition deteriorated to critical levels, my mental defenses also began to break down. I eventually accepted the inevitability of doing what I believed was the ultimate act of failure and filed for bankruptcy. There were a lot of things that changed inside of me as a result of this experience. And like anyone else forced to deal with major changes in his or her life, I learned a lot about myself. The first thing that happened, which was quite surprising, was that the stress dissipated. Actually, I was overcome with a great sense of relief, with nothing to anticipate, dread, or try so desperately to defend against. I was living through my worst fear and found there really wasn't anything about the situation that I couldn't deal with. It wasn't nearly as bad in reality as I imagined it would be. I was still alive and healthy. I was able to think and function, and I started to appreciate my ability to think as my greatest asset. This sense of appreciation began to grow into a deeper level of understanding about the basic nature of my identity. For the most part, I grew up believing that who I was consisted of the things that I owned. The more possessions I owned, the more of a person it made me. What I began to realize is that I was more than the things I had accumulated. When the facade was stripped away, it allowed me to sense this deeper dimension that, up to this point, I had only the slightest inkling of. These new awarenesses, in turn, helped me understand how being wrong and losing something didn't in any way diminish me as a person. I was beginning to learn that there was a certain freedom in granting myself permission to be wrong, and maybe there was no such thing as a failure unless something positive and useful isn't learned from the experience. However, I didn't relate these personal experiences because I thought they were particularly unusual, except for one. Everyone knows there are many traders who lose everything they own, and even though some of them will come to the same kind of awarenesses about themselves, they wouldn't necessarily be able to do it as a trader, considering the financial requirements. I, too, was not in a financial position to keep on trading, except that I still had my job at Merrill Lynch. In fact, for me, it was business as usual, as if nothing at all had happened. I certainly wasn't about to announce to my customers or anyone in the office that I had just filed for bankruptcy. My job as an account executive was one of the few things I had left, and as far as I was concerned, it depended on me being a good trader. This is the one key difference for me that ultimately led to the creation of this book. I was fortunate enough to be able to keep on trading, although not with my own money, while these major psychological changes were taking place, putting me in a unique position to examine and study the way in which the condition of my inner psychological environment affected what I experienced in the outer physical environment. This relationship between inner and outer isn't always that apparent, but in this situation, it was inescapable. I learned that the markets offer the trader an opportunity to profit from price movement, and these opportunities are basically in perpetual motion. It is an environment where the individual has the freedom to create his own results, unimpeded by many of the constraints that exist in everyday social life. These never-ending opportunities make the market a perfect mirror of the trader's attitude. What the trader sees in that movement and what he can do about it, the markets have no control over. All the choices and all the power to turn these choices into experience reside in the mind of each trader. For example, if I perceived the market as a threat, afraid of what it might take away from me, it wasn't because the outside conditions were actually threatening me in some way. It became very apparent to me that my fear was a result of my inability to anticipate events or act in a way that most appropriately served my best interests. It was only the lack of trust I had in myself to do what needed to be done that I was really afraid of. Furthermore, I discovered that my mental framework was structured to avoid losses at all costs, and in my desperate attempts to do so, I actually created them. You can think of it this way. None of us has the mental capacity to be aware of everything going on in the environment at once. The environmental information we focus our attention on, out of all that exists, will be the information that has the most importance to us. As we allocate more and more of our attention to certain kinds of information, because of its importance, we are at the same time systematically excluding other types of information from our awareness. I created my losses instead of avoiding them simply because I was trying to avoid them. Instead of being positively focused on market information that would indicate the potential for opportunity, I was more concerned with information that validated what I feared the most. As a result, a great deal of market information pertaining to other possibilities and opportunities that existed in any given moment completely escaped my attention, passing me by. The only way I could have perceived these opportunities, other than after the fact, would have been to let go of whatever was causing me to divert my attention away from what was happening in the market now. I had no way of knowing what I was missing out on until my beliefs about the significance of losses and being wrong started changing. Once this shift in perspective occurred, I started to notice behavior characteristics of the market and relationships between those characteristics that I was otherwise totally oblivious to. At some point, I realized that because I had already lost everything, I really didn't have anything to fear. And, as a result, I inadvertently learned one of the most important lessons to becoming a successful trader. How to accept a loss without any negative consequences. No guilt, anger, shame, or self-punishment. As my fear of losing dissipated, I was seeing and experiencing a different market because I was different. It was as if someone had removed blinders, which I didn't know existed, from my eyes. Up till then, my trading had always been affected by my fears. I didn't have the slightest notion of what it would be like to trade without fear, or that doing it was even a possibility, and least of all, that it was, in fact, necessary to be successful. What also became very apparent to me was the extent to which all of my fears had effectively blocked me from understanding why it was so absolutely necessary to have some clearly defined trading and money management rules that must be followed. It was all starting to make sense. The more I followed my rules, the more I trusted myself. The more I trusted myself, the more I could focus my attention on subtle relationships in the market's behavior to learn new things about the market, helping me become a better trader. Eventually, I could gauge the positive effects these new attitudes had on my ability to shift my perspective and flow with the markets. The less I cared about whether or not I was wrong, the clearer things became, making it much easier to move in and out of positions, cutting my losses short to make myself mentally available to take the next opportunity. By June 1982, I was starting to make consistent money for my customers who relied on me for their trades. Not a lot of money by most traders' standards, but steady. I was having winning days that were turning into winning weeks and months. Then sometime in August 1982, I thought,